The day the recruits arrived at the military training camp, they were full of anticipation, their hearts pounding with excitement and nerves. Among them was one young man who stood out, a black recruit named Malik. He had always dreamed of becoming a soldier, ever since he was a little boy. He watched his father and uncles serve, listening to their stories of bravery and sacrifice. They had built a legacy of courage, and Malik wanted to carry that forward. But as he stepped off the bus and into the training camp, his excitement began to turn into unease. The harsh commands and stern faces of the drill sergeants made the air feel tense, heavy with authority. Malik had heard stories about this particular drill sergeant, a man named Sergeant Tucker, who had a reputation for being especially tough on new recruits. But what they didn't tell you about Sergeant Tucker was the uglier side of him, the racial prejudice that often found its way into his training methods. Malik, trying to keep his focus on his goal, told himself that he would rise above whatever came his way. He was determined to prove himself. Yet, as the morning drill began, the reality of the camp hit him hard. There were the usual push-ups, running laps, and marches, but there was something different about how Sergeant Tucker treated him. While others were given a fair shot, Malik seemed to be the target of the sergeant's harshest commands. "Move it, recruit." Sergeant Tucker barked at Malik. "What's wrong, are you too slow to keep up?" Malik bit his lip, forcing himself to keep moving, to ignore the sharp sting of the sergeant's words. He had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. His skin color was something he couldn't change, and it seemed to be the reason behind the extra scrutiny. But he refused to let the hate in the sergeant's eyes make him falter. As the day wore on, Malik noticed how Sergeant Tucker would single him out, sometimes for the smallest things, like his stance while marching or the way he held his rifle. It was as if the sergeant was watching him more closely than the others. Each mistake, no matter how minor, was met with cruel punishment. Other recruits began to notice too, whispering behind his back. Some sympathized with him, while others stood back, too afraid to intervene. Malik was a newcomer, and that's all they saw. But despite the mistreatment, Malik stood tall, never letting the hate show. He wasn't about to let one person's prejudice define him. He kept his eyes focused on the end goal, completing the training and earning the respect he deserved. He had learned from his father and grandfather that the path to honor wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. In the mess hall that evening, Malik sat alone at a table, picking at his food. The rest of the recruits were gathered in groups, talking and laughing as they exchanged stories. Malik had tried to join in earlier, but the moment he sat down, the chatter stopped, and he felt the eyes of the others on him. It wasn't because they disliked him, it was the silent tension of those who didn't know what to say. He had seen it before, back in school, back when people made assumptions about him based on his appearance. But Malik didn't mind. He wasn't here to make friends, he was here to prove something to himself and to everyone who ever doubted him. He had known this would be hard, but nothing had ever been handed to him. His family had taught him to work for everything, to never expect anyone to give him a break. Later that evening, after the day's drills and training, Malik found himself in the barracks, lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The room was filled with the sounds of quiet conversation, snoring, and the occasional shuffle of boots against the floor. Despite the exhaustion from the day's activities, sleep didn't come easy. His mind kept drifting back to Sergeant Tucker's words, to the extra attention he had been getting, and to the nagging feeling that the sergeant's behavior wasn't just about training, it was personal. Malik knew that this wasn't just about his performance. It was about who he was and where he came from. Sergeant Tucker's treatment of him wasn't a coincidence, it was rooted in something deeper, something Malik had seen far too many times before: racism. He didn't understand why some people were like that. Why did they care about skin color? It didn't change who a person was or what they were capable of. His father had always told him that the strength of a person was measured by their actions, not the color of their skin. Malik believed that. He knew his worth. He just had to show everyone else. The next day, the drills began again. Sergeant Tucker immediately picked up where he had left off, shouting at Malik for the smallest misstep. "What's the matter with you, recruit?" he roared, his face red with anger. "Can't even march straight. You think the army is going to let you slack off like this?" Malik took a deep breath, his chest tightening. He could feel his temper rising, but he knew that losing control wouldn't help. He focused on his steps, making sure each one was firm and precise. It wasn't about winning the sergeant's approval, it was about showing him that he couldn't break him. Malik wasn't going to be another statistic, another recruit who fell victim to prejudice. He was stronger than that. As the day progressed, Malik's focus sharpened. The drills were grueling, the heat oppressive, but he didn't let it break him. He kept his eyes on the horizon, pushing through the fatigue, telling himself that every step was bringing him closer to his goal. He could do this. He had to do this. Despite all the adversity, Malik kept going, refusing to let the hatred he saw in Sergeant Tucker's eyes derail him. Every time the sergeant mocked him, he grew stronger, more determined. And as the days passed, Malik began to realize something important: this was his test. Not just of his physical strength, but of his character. If he could make it through this, if he could keep going no matter what, he would prove to everyone, including himself, that he was worthy of respect. By the end of the week, Malik had grown used to the insults, the ridicule, and the overwhelming sense of being singled out. But he also realized something else. The other recruits were starting to see what was happening. Some of them began to speak up when Sergeant Tucker targeted Malik. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And it was enough to give Malik hope. He wasn't alone in this. He wasn't going to let the actions of one man define his journey. Every day, he was proving to himself that no matter how tough things got, he could handle it. Malik's story was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. The days at the training camp began to blend together for Malik. Each morning, he woke up before the sun, his body aching from the previous day's drills. The relentless exercises seemed to have no end, and while his fellow recruits groaned and complained, Malik kept his head down and focused on what mattered most: getting through the day. But despite his determination, the harsh treatment from Sergeant Tucker only intensified. Sergeant Tucker had a knack for finding Malik's weaknesses and exploiting them. Whether it was making him do extra push-ups for a slight mistake during a drill, or accusing him of not following orders when the recruit had done nothing wrong, the sergeant seemed to be on a mission to break Malik's spirit. Other recruits, who had once sympathized with him, began to keep their distance. They had seen how the drill sergeant treated Malik and didn't want to risk being next in line for his wrath. Malik noticed the change, but he wasn't angry. He understood. No one wanted to become the target of Sergeant Tucker's cruelty. He couldn't fault them for wanting to protect themselves. But that didn't stop the loneliness from creeping in. In the silence of the barracks after a long day of drills, Malik found himself alone. There were no real friends to talk to, no one to share his frustrations with. It was a strange feeling being surrounded by people but feeling so isolated. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that wore him down. It was the mental toll of being constantly scrutinized, the feeling of being judged before he even had a chance to prove himself. But despite the loneliness, Malik never allowed himself to show weakness. Every time Sergeant Tucker singled him out, Malik pushed through it. Every insult, every degrading comment, was met with silence. He wouldn't give the sergeant the satisfaction of seeing him break. One day, during an especially grueling drill, Sergeant Tucker barked at Malik, accusing him of not putting enough effort into his push-ups. Malik could feel the eyes of the other recruits on him, but he refused to let their stares distract him. His arms trembled from the strain, but he continued to push himself, each rep harder than the last. Sergeant Tucker, sensing a moment of weakness, stepped closer, his face contorted in a sneer. "You think you're tough, don't you?" the sergeant growled. "You're nothing but a joke. If you can't even do a push-up right, how do you expect to survive here?" Malik's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He focused all his energy on completing the drill. The pain in his arms was unbearable, but he refused to stop. He couldn't. Not now. Not when he had come so far. After what felt like an eternity, the drill finally ended. Malik's body was drenched in sweat, and his chest heaved with every breath, but he stood tall. Sergeant Tucker glared at him, expecting a response, some sign of defeat. But Malik simply wiped the sweat from his brow and stood at attention, waiting for the next command. The other recruits, who had been watching the exchange in silence, seemed to have a new respect for him. They had seen how the sergeant had tried to break Malik, and yet he stood his ground. Some even began to offer small gestures of support. One recruit, a young man from the Midwest named Ryan, quietly passed Malik a bottle of water as they filed back to the barracks. It was a simple gesture, but to Malik, it meant the world. It was a sign that he wasn't invisible, that there were still people who saw him as more than just the sergeant's target. That night, as Malik lay in his bunk, he thought about Ryan's small act of kindness. He wasn't alone in this, after all. There were still people who understood, who didn't let the racism and cruelty around them dictate their actions. Maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. But just as Malik began to find some comfort in the idea that there were allies in the camp, the next day arrived with more challenges. Sergeant Tucker, clearly frustrated by Malik's ability to endure, changed his tactics. Instead of focusing solely on him during drills, he began to make life difficult in more subtle ways. Malik would be given the most difficult tasks, the ones no one else wanted to do. He was often assigned to clean the latrines or sweep the entire barracks, while the other recruits got away with lighter tasks. At first, Malik tried to accept it without complaint, telling himself that it was just part of the training. But as the days passed, the resentment started to build. He knew what was happening. It was another form of punishment, another attempt to wear him down. But it didn't matter. He would keep going, no matter what. The hardest part was the constant whispering behind his back. Some recruits, too afraid to speak out, began to mock him when the drill sergeant wasn't around. Malik would catch snippets of conversation in the mess hall or as he walked through the camp. "Did you see how Tucker was on him today?" one recruit whispered to another. "It's like he's got it out for him." Malik didn't respond. He didn't let it get to him. Instead, he focused on keeping his head down and finishing the work. He couldn't afford to show weakness. He couldn't let them see how much it hurt to be treated like an outsider, like he didn't belong. But there was one moment that almost broke him. It happened during a particularly difficult drill, when the recruits were asked to carry heavy equipment up a steep hill. Malik, already exhausted from the morning's exercises, struggled to keep up. Sergeant Tucker, as usual, was right behind him, barking orders. "Come on, recruit. Pick up the pace." Sergeant Tucker yelled. "You're holding everyone else back." Malik's legs were on fire, but he pushed forward, his body screaming for rest. He didn't want to disappoint his fellow recruits, didn't want to be the reason they failed. But the weight of the equipment was unbearable, and he stumbled, his knee buckling as he reached the top of the hill. Sergeant Tucker saw it as an opportunity to humiliate him further. "Look at this. Pathetic," he shouted. "Can't even finish a simple task. I knew you wouldn't last." Malik's heart raced, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. He felt the sting of his failure, the weight of Sergeant Tucker's words cutting deep. But then, something inside him clicked. This wasn't who he was. This wasn't how it was going to end. He stood up, wiped the dirt from his pants, and picked up the equipment again. His knees ached, his chest burned, but he kept moving. He didn't look back at the sergeant, didn't let the humiliation affect him. And as he reached the top of the hill, he realized that it didn't matter what Sergeant Tucker thought. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. The only thing that mattered was that he finished. He had proven to himself that he was stronger than they gave him credit for. That night, as Malik lay in his bunk, he felt a sense of pride wash over him. The road ahead was still long, but he was starting to see it differently. He was stronger than he had been when he first arrived. He was growing, learning to endure, and that was something no one could take from him. Sergeant Tucker's cruelty had only made him tougher. Malik was no longer the same person who had arrived at this camp, unsure and nervous. He was becoming a soldier, someone who could face the toughest challenges and still keep moving forward. The days at the training camp seemed to blur together for Malik. Each morning, the sun rose before him, and he was already on his feet, dressed in uniform, and ready to face another day of grueling training. He had come to accept the exhaustion, the sweat, and the constant pressure to perform. But what remained a constant struggle was the hostility that Sergeant Tucker seemed to have toward him. It wasn't just the insults and harsh words anymore, now, it was the subtle cruelty that pushed Malik to his limits. Sergeant Tucker had started targeting him more directly, making sure he was always the one assigned the hardest tasks. Malik would often find himself carrying heavy equipment up long hills or being sent to clean the barracks at odd hours of the night. It wasn't just about training anymore. The sergeant seemed to be going out of his way to make sure Malik knew that he wasn't welcome, that he wasn't good enough. Malik had long since stopped expecting any fairness. He had learned to brace himself for the next challenge, whatever it might be. But it wasn't easy. Every day felt like a battle, not just against the physical demands of the camp, but against the mental toll of constant mistreatment. The worst part was that no one seemed to care. The other recruits were either too afraid to speak up or simply didn't notice how badly Sergeant Tucker was treating him. They saw what was happening, but no one intervened. They didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to be the next target. One afternoon, the recruits were tasked with a particularly tough obstacle course. The course was designed to test their endurance, strength, and mental toughness. It was a series of challenging physical exercises: climbing walls, crawling under barbed wire, carrying heavy objects, and running long distances. It was tough, but it was a part of the training. No one expected it to be easy. As Malik prepared for the course, he noticed Sergeant Tucker was already watching him, a slight smirk on his face. Malik had learned to tune out the sergeant's presence as best he could, but today was different. There was a sharpness in the air, a sense that this would be another one of those days where he would be pushed to the edge. The drill began, and Malik took off with the rest of the recruits. His body was already sore from previous days, but he focused on the course ahead. His legs burned as he sprinted to the first obstacle, a tall wooden wall. It was one of the hardest obstacles for Malik because of his height, but he had faced worse. With determination, he grabbed the top of the wall and hoisted himself over, landing on the other side with a grunt of effort. He had done it. But when he looked up, he saw Sergeant Tucker glaring at him from the other side of the wall, arms crossed. It was like the sergeant was waiting for him to make a mistake. And sure enough, as Malik moved on to the next obstacle, a rope climb, things began to unravel. Malik's arms were tired, but he climbed the rope as best as he could. His hands were sore from the constant grip, but he reached the top and began to descend. However, as he was halfway down, his foot slipped, and he lost his balance, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. The other recruits around him stopped and turned to look, but Malik quickly pushed himself back up, determined not to let the mistake define him. But Sergeant Tucker's voice rang out from across the course. "Pathetic," the sergeant yelled. "You think you're ready for the real world? You can't even finish a simple rope climb." Malik's heart raced as he stood up, brushing dirt off his uniform. He had made a mistake, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He couldn't let Sergeant Tucker see how badly the criticism stung. Instead, Malik took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked back to the rope to try again. This time, Malik was more focused. He knew he couldn't afford to mess up again. As he climbed the rope, his muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. With every pull, every movement, he felt the weight of the sergeant's words pressing on him, but he pushed it all aside. He was stronger than that. He had to be. When he reached the top this time, there was no mistake. He carefully made his way down and landed on solid ground. The other recruits nodded in approval, some clapping quietly as they watched him finish the obstacle. Malik felt a sense of pride, but it was short-lived. Sergeant Tucker's eyes were still on him, still waiting for him to fail. The sergeant had been pushing him harder than anyone else, and it was starting to take its toll. Malik was exhausted. Every muscle in his body was screaming for a break, but he couldn't stop. He had to finish the course, not just for himself, but to prove to Sergeant Tucker that he wasn't going to break. The next obstacle was a series of crawling tunnels. Malik had seen it before, and he knew it was one of the easier obstacles, but the problem was that he had to crawl on his stomach, squeezing through tight spaces. His body was already sore, and the thought of squeezing through those tunnels made his chest tighten. But he had no choice. As he crawled through the tunnels, the dirt and mud got everywhere. His arms and legs were scraped and bruised, but he pushed forward. He wasn't going to quit. He wasn't going to give the sergeant the satisfaction of seeing him fail. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, Malik crawled his way to the end. He could hear the sound of his fellow recruits cheering as he emerged, filthy but determined. By the time Malik reached the final obstacle, he was beyond tired. His body felt like it was on fire, and his mind was beginning to fog over. But he couldn't stop now. The last challenge was a sprint to the finish line. It seemed simple enough, but Malik knew that after everything he had been through, this was going to be the hardest part. He took off at a sprint, pushing himself harder than he ever had before. His legs felt like lead, but he kept going, each step bringing him closer to the finish line. He could hear Sergeant Tucker's voice in the distance, taunting him, urging him to slow down, to give up. But Malik wasn't going to listen. With everything he had left, Malik crossed the finish line. His chest heaved as he collapsed to his knees, breathless and exhausted. The other recruits gathered around him, clapping him on the back and offering words of encouragement. Malik's heart was racing, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to smile. He had done it. Despite the obstacles, the insults, and the pressure, he had made it through. Sergeant Tucker, however, remained silent. He was watching from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. Malik didn't care. He had proven something to himself. He had shown that no matter how much the sergeant tried to break him, he couldn't. He was stronger than the cruelty, stronger than the prejudice. And that was something no one could take away from him. Later that evening, as Malik lay in his bunk, exhausted but satisfied, he thought about the course. He had endured it, but more than that, he had learned something important. Every day, he was becoming stronger not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. He was learning to rise above the challenges, to endure the harshest conditions, and to never let anyone's cruelty define him. Malik had been through a lot, but he wasn't done yet. He still had a long way to go, and Sergeant Tucker would continue to be a challenge. But Malik wasn't afraid anymore. He knew who he was, and he knew what he was capable of. He wasn't going to let anyone, especially Sergeant Tucker, take that away from him. The days in the training camp seemed to get harder, but Malik was no longer the same person who had first walked through the gates. He had learned to keep pushing, even when it felt impossible. Each morning, He woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The physical exhaustion was still there, the bruises and sore muscles were constant companions, but he had started to feel something else: strength. Not just in his body, but in his mind. He was learning how to face every challenge head-on without letting the negativity around him pull him down. But Sergeant Tucker's cruelty was a constant presence, lurking just behind every command. Malik couldn't escape it. The sergeant had found new ways to torment him. It wasn't just the physical tasks anymore, the drills, and the obstacle courses. It was the little things: deliberate snubs, the cold stares, and the constant reminder that Malik didn't belong here. The man had an unshakable belief that Malik was somehow inferior, and he made sure to make it known every chance he got. Despite this, Malik kept his focus. He kept his eyes on his goal: to finish the training, to become the soldier he had always wanted to be. He couldn't afford to let Sergeant Tucker get to him. Not now. Not when he had already come this far. One afternoon, during a break between drills, Malik sat by himself on a bench near the training field, trying to catch his breath. The camp was buzzing with the usual noise: other recruits talking, laughing, or cleaning their gear, but Malik remained alone. He was used to it by now. He had learned to keep his distance from the others. They weren't bad people, but no one seemed willing to risk standing up for him, not with Sergeant Tucker watching their every move. It was easier to just let Malik take the heat. Easier to pretend they didn't see it. But that didn't mean Malik wasn't aware of the subtle glances, the whispers that followed him when he walked by. It wasn't always obvious, but he could feel it. He knew they saw him as different, as someone who didn't fit in. They might have been too scared to say anything, but their silence spoke volumes. Malik sighed and stretched his legs out in front of him. His body was sore, his muscles aching from the morning drills, but there was something else: a deep tiredness that went beyond the physical. It was the weariness of constantly being on guard, of always waiting for the next insult or the next punishment. But as he sat there, something in him shifted. Maybe it was the sun shining down, or maybe it was the quiet moment of peace, but he suddenly realized something important. He was stronger than this. He had been tested in ways that no one else had, and yet here he was. Still standing. Still fighting. As if on cue, Sergeant Tucker appeared, striding across the field with his usual stern expression. Malik immediately straightened up, instinctively preparing for whatever the sergeant might throw his way. The others nearby fell silent, their eyes shifting uncomfortably, but they didn't dare make a sound. Sergeant Tucker walked up to Malik, his gaze cold and unwavering. "You're wasting your time sitting here," the sergeant said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You're behind, recruit. Pick up the pace." Malik's heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. He didn't let the anger build up inside him, not this time. He had learned that responding with frustration only gave Sergeant Tucker what he wanted. Instead, Malik simply stood up, his back straight, and gave the sergeant a nod. "Understood, sir," Malik replied, his voice calm. Sergeant Tucker's eyes narrowed, as though he was looking for any sign of weakness. But Malik didn't give him the satisfaction. He turned and walked away, the others parting to let him pass. They all watched, some with pity, others with indifference. But Malik didn't care anymore. He didn't need their approval. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of drills and exercises, each one more demanding than the last. Malik felt like his body might give out at any moment, but he kept pushing. There was a part of him, deep down, that refused to stop. He wasn't going to quit. Not because of Sergeant Tucker, not because of the other recruits, and not because of the exhaustion. He was going to finish this on his own terms. By the time evening rolled around, Malik was exhausted, but there was something different about how he felt. He had made it through another day, another round of humiliation, and he hadn't broken. His body might have been tired, but his spirit was stronger than ever. That night, as Malik lay in his bunk, staring up at the ceiling, he thought about how far he had come. The first days at camp felt like a lifetime ago. He had been nervous then, unsure of himself, but now, he was different. Stronger. More confident. He had taken everything Sergeant Tucker had thrown at him and still come out standing. And that was something no one could take away from him. But there was still one thing that weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sergeant Tucker knew more than he let on. There had been moments, small moments, when the sergeant's gaze had seemed, almost knowing. As though he could see something in Malik that no one else could. But Malik didn't have time to dwell on that. He couldn't afford to. Not when he had so much to prove. The next day, during a grueling physical endurance test, Malik found himself struggling more than usual. The drill required them to carry heavy equipment across a distance, then run a mile. Malik's legs were tired from the day before, and his muscles screamed in protest with every step. He pushed through the pain, but his body was beginning to fail him. Sergeant Tucker stood at the finish line, watching every recruit closely. Malik felt the weight of his eyes on him, like the sergeant was waiting for him to collapse, to fall short. But Malik wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. He gritted his teeth, focused on the road ahead, and forced his legs to keep moving. Halfway through the run, Malik's vision blurred. His breathing became labored, and his legs started to feel like they were made of lead. But he kept going. With every step, he told himself that he couldn't stop, that he had to finish. He was so close. The finish line was right there, just a few hundred feet away. He pushed forward, feeling the burn in his chest and the weakness in his legs. And then, as if by some miracle, he crossed the line. His body collapsed to the ground, but he had made it. He had finished. As he lay on the ground, gasping for air, Sergeant Tucker approached. Malik didn't look up, but he could feel the sergeant standing over him. The usual sneer was gone. Instead, there was something else. For the first time, Sergeant Tucker didn't say anything cruel. He didn't make a sarcastic remark or bark an order. He simply stood there, watching Malik recover. Malik didn't know what to make of it. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't care. He had done it. He had pushed himself beyond his limits, and he had finished. And that was enough for him. Later, as the recruits gathered for the evening briefing, Malik sat quietly, his body still aching, but a sense of calm washing over him. He had earned his place here. He had proven it to himself. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe just maybe he was beginning to earn the respect of those around him. Sergeant Tucker was still a challenge, but Malik knew one thing for sure, he wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't afraid of the drills, the insults, or even the sergeant. He was ready for whatever came next. As Malik woke up the next morning, there was a strange sense of peace that washed over him. The usual nervousness, the fear of what the day might bring, had started to fade. He had endured so much over the past weeks, every challenge, every drill, and every moment of humiliation, but now he felt stronger than ever. His muscles ached, and his body was exhausted, but his spirit was unbreakable. There was no turning back now. He had come too far to let anything stop him. The morning routine began as usual, preparing for the drills, getting dressed in his uniform, and heading out to the field. But today, there was something different in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Malik could feel the eyes of the other recruits on him as he walked through the camp. For the first time, they weren't just avoiding him. They weren't whispering behind his back. No, today they looked at him with something else: respect. It wasn't just the recruits who noticed the change in Malik. Sergeant Tucker had been watching him more closely these past few days, but this time, his gaze wasn't full of disdain or anger. There was something different in his eyes. Malik couldn't quite place it, but he knew that whatever it wasn't the same contempt he had been receiving since the day he arrived. The day's drill began, and Malik focused on what he had to do. It was another tough physical challenge, but this time, Malik felt ready. He had trained his body and mind to push past the pain, to ignore the exhaustion. The drill was simple enough: run a certain distance, then carry heavy equipment over uneven terrain, and finish with a set of push-ups. It wasn't easy, but Malik had faced worse. He had faced everything Sergeant Tucker had thrown at him, and yet, here he was. As the recruits took their positions, Malik felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. The starting signal went off, and they were off. Malik's legs carried him swiftly, his feet pounding against the ground, his body moving with a purpose he had never known before. He wasn't just running anymore, he was proving something. Not to Sergeant Tucker, not to the other recruits, but to himself. He was proving that he was stronger than they thought, stronger than he had ever imagined. When he reached the equipment, Malik paused only for a moment to catch his breath before lifting the heavy load. His muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. This was his moment, the moment where he would show them that he was capable of so much more than they gave him credit for. He moved through the obstacle with determination, each step bringing him closer to the finish line. As he neared the end of the course, he could see Sergeant Tucker standing by the finish line, his arms crossed, watching intently. For a moment, Malik felt a flicker of doubt. What if he wasn't fast enough? What if he didn't make it in time? But then he remembered all that he had been through, all the times he had been knocked down only to get back up again. He had made it this far, and nothing was going to stop him now. With the finish line in sight, Malik pushed himself harder. His body was beyond exhausted, but he kept going, every fiber of his being focused on one thing: finishing. His lungs burned, his legs felt like they were about to give out, but he refused to stop. The distance between him and the finish line seemed to stretch endlessly, but Malik's willpower kept him moving forward. Step by step, he closed the gap. Finally, with one last burst of energy, Malik crossed the finish line. He didn't collapse, didn't fall to the ground in exhaustion as he had in previous drills. Instead, he stood tall, his chest heaving, his body drenched in sweat, but his face was filled with a sense of quiet pride. He had done it. He had finished. And for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he belonged here. The other recruits were already catching up, some of them stopping to congratulate him, clapping him on the back. Malik smiled, but it wasn't just because of their words. It was because he had earned their respect, and he had earned it through sheer determination and grit. Sergeant Tucker stepped forward, his gaze still intense, but something had shifted. There was no mocking in his eyes, no insults waiting to spill from his lips. Instead, he gave Malik a single, sharp nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Malik had won the battle not just with Sergeant Tucker, but with himself. He had proven that no matter what obstacles were in his way, he could overcome them. The day wasn't over, of course. There was still more training, more drills, more tests to face. But for the first time, Malik felt like he could handle it. He had faced the hardest challenge of all, facing down his own doubts, and come out victorious. And if he could do that, he could do anything. Later that evening, when the recruits gathered in the mess hall for dinner, Malik sat with his head held high. He wasn't alone anymore. There were no whispers, no looks of judgment. The other recruits treated him as one of their own, and even though he had never needed their approval, it felt good. It felt like he had finally found his place here, in this world of discipline and challenge. As the days passed, Malik's confidence grew. He still faced challenges. No one was saying the road ahead would be easy, but he no longer feared them. He was no longer the recruit who had stumbled into the camp, unsure and nervous. He was a soldier. A man who had learned to fight not just for survival, but for respect. And that respect was something no one could take away from him. Sergeant Tucker, for all his cruelty and prejudice, had been the one to test Malik's limits. But in doing so, he had unknowingly pushed Malik to become someone stronger, someone more resilient. Malik knew there would always be people like Sergeant Tucker in the world, people who doubted him because of the color of his skin, or because of where he came from. But Malik had learned something important. He had learned that none of that mattered. What mattered was how he responded. What mattered was the strength he had found in himself when no one else believed in him. He didn't need anyone else to validate his worth. He had already proven it to himself. And so, as Malik sat quietly at dinner, looking around at the recruits who had once ignored him, he couldn't help but smile. He had earned his place here. He had fought for it, and now, there was no going back. The world may have been full of challenges, but Malik knew that he was ready for whatever came next.